This talk is basically trying to explain how easy someone with .NET skills can actually move over and start doing Dynamics 365. So this is me, I'm obviously Andrew. My first coding was back on a 286 using QBasic, mucking around with the game Gorillas, if anyone remembers the game Gorillas. They basically stood on buildings and they threw bananas at each other, and you could sit around and you could muck around. That was basically my first intro, and then I sort of started doing some gaming sort of development from there. I've built my own arcade machine. It's about 6 foot tall, 4-player. Basically any game you can think of. It took me far too long to actually build. It took me about 2 years to build and takes up a lot of space in the garage, but it is pretty amazing when I do get a whole bunch of friends over to play it. I own a lot of different gaming consoles. I've got an Atari, I've got a Game Gear, I've got a Mega Drive, I've got a Nintendo 64, I've got multiple Wiis, I've got an Xbox, a PS3, an Xbox 360 and a PS4. I don't actually get to game that much these days, but I do have them all sitting around at home. They're just sort of, one day I'd love to have them in some kind of display cabinet, but at the moment they're all just stuck in boxes. I'm probably the only person outside Microsoft who thinks the latest SharePoint is going to be really big. Basically, towards late last year, Adam actually started speaking to us about looking at redoing our intranet in the new SharePoint, and I started investigating it, and I was actually sort of really apprehensive about it because of my past experiences with SharePoint was nothing good. And the more I started investigating it, the more I was really interested in it. And I haven't been able to do too much development in it, but I definitely think it's going to be one of those things that more and more organizations are going to really start ramping up and using it for their intranet. For anyone who isn't sort of aware where it's going, is basically what they've done is they've limited the focus and made sure that it's based on two things. It's based on document management and intranet. And the intranet is really a rich experience now. You can actually do React development, you can do Angular development, and your user interface now is so amazing compared to what it used to be in the old SharePoint days. I'm not sure if anyone actually has done any development in the old SharePoint where you had to hack away at the pages to actually get it into display. You've got none of that now, and what you can do is you can do your separate components, and you can build up a component and actually just dump that on the page as a web part. And something that we're really going to be looking forward to doing is doing our SSW page and being able to have information that's coming from our, whether or not it's our email or whether or not it's from SSW Sophie, pulling all of this information into one central location, and also sharing components. Because it is going to be using Angular or using React, we're going to be able to use those components across different sort of platforms. So that's going to be something really exciting for us. I was also the best looking staff member at SSW in 2017. Self-appointed, but you know, I think it still counts. Yeah, you know, I threw myself a big function, doesn't that count? Outside work, this is my 10-month-old there, and my 3 beagles. I know it's a horrible picture, but if anyone actually has ever seen a beagle, trying to get a photo of 3 beagles facing a camera is a nightmare. We basically foster beagles, which is the front one is actually a foster. And you can see, obviously, my daughter Peyton there wearing her SSW branded onesie as well.
Is that real?
Yeah. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what is Dynamics 365. I'm sure probably a lot of you have got some idea, or you might have a lot of idea. I'm going to try and breeze through it as much as I can, just giving you the key points. And then we're going to sit there and we're going to discuss what are the ways that we can actually use this to enhance Dynamics 365 from a .NET user point of view. You know, how am I actually going to be able to sit down and develop something tomorrow, essentially? We'll actually then go into the .NET skills and explaining, okay, right, this is what I need to do. How is that going to link into my skills? So we kind of go from the first one of actually sitting there saying, we're going to have a Dynamics 365 environment, and we want to get it looking how we want it, understanding how it all goes together, and then we're going to really start to actually make it our own, I guess you would probably say. And then I've got 3 different demos. So the first one is developing an inquiry form with the SDK, which is just showing you an external website and how it can interact with the system. And then developing a custom workflow, which is basically going to be within the system, and it's just going to do some basic data validation in the system. And then finally, I'm just going to show you some JavaScript stuff as well. So I think the next one would be my little video. Has anyone here seen IT Crowd? If you have, you might recognize this video.
You wouldn't steal a handbag. You wouldn't steal a car. You wouldn't steal a baby. You wouldn't shoot a policeman and then steal his helmet. You wouldn't go to the toilet in his helmet and then send it to the policeman's grieving widow and then steal it again. Downloading films is stealing. If you do it, you will face the consequences.
Man, these anti-piracy ads are getting really mean.
So, what does that have to do with this topic? You wouldn't develop a website using pure HTML and JavaScript, so why should your CRM or ERP be any different? If you're going to build a system, you wouldn't start from scratch. You would sit there and you would work out, okay, what framework's going to help me do my job better for my client and make it easier on myself? And that's really where Dynamics 365 comes into it. There's a lot of benefits that you're going to get from using it. Sometimes it might not be the perfect solution and you need to make that call. However, if you do, it's going to come with a lot of benefits. It's going to mean that your development time is going to be sped up and you're probably going to get a better result for your clients. So what is Dynamics 365? So to understand Dynamics 365, we need to go back to 2000. And basically what happened was there was a whole bunch of organizations doing ERP or CRM kind of development. So there was DamnGuard, I think it's Data, and Navision, who basically merged back in 2000. And so they had a whole suite of different products that they then sort of merged in together. So there was Dynamics Nav, which used to be called Navision. There was Exapta, which has become Dynamics AX, and then Concord C5, which became Dynamics C5. So they merged into one organization back in 2000. At a similar kind of stage, we had Great Plains Software, which acquired Solomon Software. So Solomon Software developed a product which was called Solomon 4, and Solomon 4 ended up becoming Dynamics SL. Later in 2000, Microsoft then acquired Great Plains Software, and that included Dynamics GP, and then obviously Dynamics SL from earlier in that year. And then in 2002, Microsoft acquired Navision. Finally, 2003, then they developed Microsoft CRM. So basically you can see there we've got 6 different products, all called Dynamics, developed by however many different organizations, that basically then Microsoft decided to give the same name, like put them all under the same umbrella. The issue with that was the products just weren't integrated. There was a couple of times we had organizations come to us and say, we would like to integrate our Dynamics CRM and our Nav, and Microsoft had a connector and they actually would say, don't use the connector. It doesn't actually work all the time and you can run into issues. Dynamics Nav generally had more critical data and there was some issues with it corrupting data. Those kinds of things were coming up more and more often because there was all these different products. And then due to the sort of organic nature of the products, some of them were actually, marketed in one area and then some were marketed in another area. And they just all sort of came under the same umbrella but didn't actually work together. And the look and feel was actually different between the items as well, which really just didn't make the Dynamics solution actually work for anyone. So now we have Dynamics 365, and this is a new rebuild which is based on the Microsoft Common Data Service. So at the base, it's all using the Common Data Service, which means that all of these systems now talk to each other. It's a CRM and ERP in one. I say a CRM and ERP in one, but it's really still a suite of solutions. If you actually go out and you actually create a system and you actually get the different components, you'll see sometimes when you navigate from one component to another, you'll actually change URL. Rather than all of them just have one URL, they actually have different URLs. So when I actually come back and show you the next bit, you'll actually see some of them still go to the CRM URL, some go to a Nav URL, and then I'm pretty sure there's another one as well. And so basically Dynamics 365 essentially is a combination of CRM, Nav, and AX functionality. Now, these products are still in some areas working independently. Nav is still out there as an on-premise solution, but bits and pieces have basically been taken and sort of moved into Dynamics. So the development streams might have modified a bit, however, the general concepts are still there. And then the big one is too, greater integration with AppSource. So some of the items that we actually have within Dynamics 365 are actually available through AppSource. So for instance, if you would like to use Dynamics Financials is actually in the AppSource. So you basically go in there and you actually install the app, and that's actually what builds up within your suite of tools. So here's a general overflow of Dynamics 365. And so you can see here, basically we have our different sort of components that you would see in a CRM/ERP. So there's obviously sales, there's marketing, there's finance, there's project service automation, there's customer service, there's operations, there's field service. So any type of sort of solution where you're going to have a standard CRM or you're going to have a full-blown ERP, you can generally use this tool to get most of your requirements. Now, the marketing one on here is really an interesting one because the marketing one is still, as far as I'm aware at least, is still sort of a bit behind the 8 ball because the marketing is actually now a concatenation of Adobe as well as Microsoft. And so they're actually working together to create a new marketing solution. So the marketing solution that's out there at the moment for Dynamics is the older one. And a lot of organizations are actually having trouble because they can't actually, they're looking to implement a marketing solution now and they actually can't because Microsoft aren't actually releasing the new one, but they're actually starting to limit the users who can use the old one. When Dynamics 365 was released, it was this amazing sort of talk about how fantastic it was that Adobe and Microsoft were working together. However, a lot of the blogs and stuff are still talking about this as to come in the future. So it's something that we're still really waiting for to be able to see how good it is. There's a lot of functionality in there that they say is going to be there, it's going to be amazing, but whether or not it's going to take over sort of click dimensions and those kinds of things are the ones that basically people use for a lot of their marketing tools at the moment. Whether or not it's going to be able to take a lot of that functionality away, we're not really sure. So why would you use it? So out of the box, Dynamics comes with your basic kind of objects that you're going to use every day. So you're going to have accounts, you're going to have contacts, you're going to have cases, you're going to have orders, you're going to have invoices, you're going to have emails, all out of the box. The security automatically connects into your Active Directory, so you can link it in with all of your existing users. So if you are within a Microsoft stack, you will actually find it really easy to connect into an existing system. It's really fast to set up and it's easy to customize. If you are interested in Dynamics 365, you can literally go jump online now. You can sign up for a trial and your trial will last for 30 days. So you can go in there and you can have a look immediately and you can muck around and play with it. So when should you use it? It's simple. You should use it when the cost to implement Dynamics 365 is lower than creating a solution bespoke. So if you're sitting there and trying to design your system and you look at it and you think, this might be able to do 80% of my products, okay, how much of that extra 20% are you actually going to have to develop compared to actually writing the whole thing yourself? Security is always a massive issue when we do development. If you're writing your own security system, you might run into a lot of different issues. If you have a security system that is, a really good library that you use, then you might not run into those issues. It's basically you using your understanding of your development process and whether or not this is right for that particular development process. So what are the ways we can enhance it? We can theme it. The theming is quite basic. So you can see basically what we can do is we can come in here, we can add a logo, we can change some of our different navigation, and we can change some colors. Now we can't change all of the colors. We are still quite limited into the general kind of structure. Dynamics works off a grid formation, so it's generally working off basically 2 columns or 3 columns for everything. So you're going to see, like in these screenshots here, you can see that we've got a couple of different graphs, and the graphs are all in sort of a grid formation. You can see that we've got on the left-hand side, we've got a nice funnel, and then beside that we've got another grid, which you can see that we've got one graph and then we've got another graph underneath it. That kind of structure is what you're going to find throughout Dynamics, and you can't really modify that too much. You can also change any of the navigation underneath. So you can see here in this case, basically what I've done is I've removed the training. The training area in Dynamics is basically just a link off to their website. So generally in most cases, I find it's pretty ineffective anyway. So I've just removed that, and then what I've done is I've just replaced sales with an SSW group. And then you can see also here, I've basically added in some custom entities as well. So I've added in user groups, I've added in sessions, I've added in session attendees, and I've added inquiries. You can customize the forms. Excuse me. So you can see here that basically what we have is we have sections, and we have tabs, and we have subgrids. We're still stuck with that layout of whether or not it's be 3 columns, whether it's 2 columns, or whether it's 1 column. It is that structure. You're not going to be able to get away from that too much. So it does have a bit of a vanilla kind of feel to it, but at the same time it is really good because it does allow you to make sure that when your users are using it, they're actually going to understand pretty quickly where things are. It means that there's not a lot of change from one form to another. So once they understand the layout of one form, they generally understand the layout of all the forms. Business process flows. So the business process flow is that bar across the top. So you can see that it's got qualify, develop, propose, and close. So essentially what that does is it sits across your form and it allows you to actually go from one object to another. So what this example is basically you have a lead. So a lead comes into your organization and you get some information. What are the key things that your organization wants to know about that lead? Do you want to know where the lead came from? Do you want to know who is related to bringing this lead in? All of those kinds of things you can basically set up here as fields that you want to capture at that time. Once you've decided those fields, you can then jump on to the next stage, in this case, develop. And what you can do is as you go from these different sections, you can actually jump from one object to another. So you can say, okay, my lead has now become an opportunity. Now on my opportunity, what are my key fields now? Once it's an opportunity, then it might become an account and a contact or both. So then once it becomes an account and contact, what other information do I want to include? Do I want to make sure that someone's followed up with this person to say thank you, make sure that we've sent out our invoices or our orders or whatever else? And it allows you to see a life cycle of an interaction all in one line. So Dynamics gets a bit confusing because they have workflows. A workflow in Dynamics is not actually what you would think of as a business workflow. A business workflow is more of an end-to-end interaction, whereas a workflow within Dynamics is a single action triggered by an event. So we have a lot of clients that come to us and say, oh, you know, how is the workflow management in Dynamics? And the first couple of times you do get caught out and you go, oh yeah, the workflows are good. But then you start realizing they're talking from a business point of view, not from a Dynamics point of view. So here's workflows. Now, it's probably very hard to see on that screen, but basically what you can do down the bottom here is you can look at any data within your system and you can say, if, for instance, email is populated, then I basically want to add this person to my mailing list. So when I check that record, tell me if the email is populated. If the email is populated, then add that record to a list. Oh, actions. Actions is quite similar to a workflow. The difference with an action is an action can be essentially triggered from anywhere. So what I can do is I can pass in a particular entity. I can pass in multiple entities. I can pass in a particular variable. It doesn't really matter. With a workflow must always be triggered from a particular record. It can be multiple records, but if it's multiple records, you'll have multiple workflows. Every workflow is triggered by a single record. Whereas an action, I can say, here is a collection of people who, again, have decided that they are going to be included in my mail merge. I want to make sure that they get some kind of feedback at the end of the year via a letter or something else. So what I can do with my action is say, I'm going to pass in all of those people and then I'm going to do something. Business rules. Now, business rules are massive with the business community because they love this, because it's a drag and drop functionality and they really like it and they understand it and they think it's good. So what you can do is you can say, these are my conditions, what do I want to do? So here's a very basic example. And again, goes back to, if my preferred method of contact is email, what I would like to do is I would like to set my email as business required. If it's not, don't. So you can do all sorts of different things like this, where you can basically come in and you can create some boxes, and you can create those boxes on the left-hand side just by clicking the add button, or you can click on the components on the right-hand side. So a lot of business users will actually try and create these themselves. Sometimes they do run into issues, but in general, they can sort of at least get the basic understanding right. So it gives them a lot of power because it means that they can at least start doing the building of it, and they don't have to explain it if they're sort of struggling to explain it to you in a system context. If they know it from a business context and they're really struggling with that translation, being able to build it themselves does actually mean that they end up feeling sort of, one, that they've got that ownership of the system, and two, you end up getting the correct result. And then finally, we can use our mad coding skills to do development. So we can do external connections using the SDK or using DLLs. We can write some custom workflow code, we can write plugins, and we can do JavaScript. How do my .NET skills help me develop with it? Well, first and foremost, as I said, it's a Microsoft product, so it speaks your language. If you're a .NET developer, you know C#, and generally you're all going to know JavaScript. So you're going to be pretty comfortable developing in these different areas. It uses the Microsoft Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement Development Guide, which used to be called the Dynamics SDK. Basically what they used to do was just have one massive zip file, and they would give you the zip file, and then basically you just pulled everything out of it. And that included any tools, that included any documentation, everything was in this one zip. What they've done is they've actually said, nope, that's not the greatest way to do it. What we're going to do is we're going to separate that out. So the Customer Engagement Development Guide is basically essentially a website now that you can go to and you can get all of your information. So you can go there, you can get your documentation, you can get some ideas, and then you can also go in and you can see the different NuGet packages they've got. So basically they have NuGet packages for any DLLs you might need to do for development. They basically have sample code, and then they also have any tools you'll need as well via NuGet packages. So it's a bit annoying with the tools. I don't like the concept of having to have a NuGet package to actually just essentially install a tool. I would rather I just had an exe, but apart from that, it is good because at least you know you're getting the updated every time, and once you get used to NuGet, which I think probably we all are now, it's not too hard to use. So when would you use JavaScript? You would use JavaScript for UI modifications. CRM4, CRM 2011, all of the past sort of flavors of Dynamics, you needed to do a lot of JavaScript. A lot of basic kind of little things you could not do easily without JavaScript. So if you wanted to show hide fields, if you wanted to set a field as required, if you wanted to validate some values, sort of even phone numbers and that kind of thing, you basically needed to do JavaScript. And so the earlier flavors were very JavaScript heavy. And the issue obviously became trying to understand how all of the JavaScript fitted together meant that a lot of the websites ended up being slow. They moved a lot of the JavaScript into business rules by allowing you to do basic things of saying, if this data is populated, then let me set this as required. That will actually work on your mobile device as well, so you don't have to worry about it, you know, whether or not the JavaScript's going to run. Not really an issue this day and age if JavaScript's going to run anyway on a mobile device. However, they have moved a lot of that over. So your JavaScript requirements are not as large now as they used to be, but there are still a lot of little things you can do. And so I've got a basic example here that we'll basically run through at the end, which is just to give you an understanding of what you can do. Plugins and custom workflows. So plugins used to be the only way to do any heavy lifting. Plugins are great because they're C# code and you can go in and you can do all sorts of stuff that you could actually do in any DLL basically. So you can just sit there and have massive amounts of classes, all handling different objects, doing whatever you want, and it was fantastic. The problem with a plugin was it was really hard to actually try and get any feedback within the CRM system itself. In the latest release, they've actually, or latest couple of releases, they've actually included the ability to actually turn on tracing, and it will actually trace back into the UI, so that you can go in the UI and you can see it. However, still that's not obviously ideal when you're running a production system to have all of your code actually sitting there logging into the system. So that's where Actions, as I sort of mentioned before, and custom workflows has become really, really beneficial, because basically what you can do is you can have your basic outline of a workflow and say, as I said, just those little things of saying, you know, is this field populated, or, you know, is this record of this type? And if it is, then run your custom code. By doing that, it gives you that ability to actually see within the system, okay, this is run. And then what you can actually see is you can say, okay, has it failed? Can I see if it's failed at my code? And then what you can also do is you can actually export out in that workflow, you can actually return the error, and you can say, this is the error that I got. So there it is, stored within that custom workflow without actually having to try and figure out how it happened in the plugin. So where possible, I start trying to use custom workflows instead, just for those things where I'm wanting to create records, where I'm wanting to do complex data changes. And then where plugins is actually really good is if you want to track a field before and after an event. So you might have a field where you basically want to say, did this field change? Or if it did change, what did it change from to? All that kind of stuff. What you can do is with plugins, you can actually get a snapshot and say, give me the snapshot before it was created, when it was saved, and then you can actually compare the two. So that's kind of really where plugins still hold their own. So the external connections are all REST API. They, back in probably, I would say CRM 2011, but it's probably a bit earlier, everything was based around SOAP. So they had a lot of DLLs that were dealing with all of the SOAP connections, and everything was SOAP. Obviously over time they started saying we want to move to REST. So essentially now everything is basically REST. They're trying to deprecate as much of the SOAP stuff as they can. I was actually saying before, I believe that they might have actually deprecated SOAP completely in the latest iteration, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But basically everything should be done via the REST API now. So it allows you to perform any of your standard CRUD updates using Dynamics 365 externally. So this is Dynamics items of note. So this is just a couple of things that are handy to know. You'll hear a lot of people talk about late bound and early bound. So essentially what they have is they have this CRM service util, which allows you to generate C# classes. So if you generate the C# class, what you can do is you can call it by name. So if I was going to, for instance, create an entity called user group, I could declare it and say, okay, here is my user group class. Otherwise, my other option is to go late bound. As you can see down the bottom, it basically says entity, and then within entity, it basically has the name. So obviously, the first one is more tightly coupled to understanding what the actual object is. Now, strangely enough, I kind of think it would be the other way, but it's actually not. The early bound actually had a slight performance hit back in the day. However, that's actually essentially pretty much gone now. So you can really use either one of your choosing. You can either use late bound or early bound. It's really up to you. Obviously, the only problem with the early bound is when you're doing early development, it annoys me because you have to actually constantly rebuild. If you have some kind of, if you have Octopus deploy or something that you can actually run that script on that's going to automatically update your DLLs, probably not a massive issue. But if you're just mucking around on your dev box, it does get annoying because you're trying to do something and then you add in a couple of extra items and then you have to go, oh, hang on, I haven't rebuilt my DLLs yet. Managed versus unmanaged. So essentially, the way that you control a solution within Dynamics is via a giant XML file. So you've got this giant XML file that basically tells the system everything that's going on. It's saying, these are the record types and objects that I have within the system. These are the fields and where they are. This is any of my workflows and how they work. And basically what you can do is you can do this XML essential representation either managed or unmanaged. So with a managed solution, basically what you do is you import it and it's tightly coupled to the solution. So if we were going to create a solution and we were going to import it into the system, again, using my example from later, using user group and user group sessions, if I went to delete that solution later on, I would actually remove those two entities. It's kind of good when you get to production because then you've kind of got that control over it. When you're doing development, you use unmanaged, because if you use unmanaged, it means that you can actually delete that solution and it doesn't actually affect any of the underlying objects. So what you basically use your unmanaged solution for is when you're doing your development, you have an unmanaged solution, you add items to it, and then you export it as managed. So you can't add or modify a managed solution. It is essentially a locked off selection of code. So basically you do any of your changes in an unmanaged solution, and then I like to deploy it managed. There is a kind of couple of different thoughts on that, whether you need to do it managed or unmanaged, but I personally prefer to do managed when it comes to production. Debugging plugins can be hard. I briefly touched on it before, but basically the issue that you have is you're running some custom code that's running behind the scenes. So you can either run a trace within the actual solution that'll log everything. Or the other option is, if you actually want to debug your code line by line, what you need to do is you need to actually run this tool, and what will happen is it'll go through and it'll create a trace file. And then that trace file you can then use to actually load into a tool called Plugin Profiler, which will basically lock into Dynamics. And then through that, you can actually find the process that is running, that is using that plugin profiler, and then run it through there. So it's kind of frustrating. So it can be annoying. So again, to me, it's a reason to try and keep your plugins minimal. Sometimes you'll hate it. If you do go down the path of using Dynamics 365, sometimes it will annoy you. Because being developers, we kind of like a bit of freedom, and it does structure itself in a way that sometimes you're going to hit a brick wall and you're going to realize that you have to turn around and change your tact. You can't, it doesn't happen all the time. And as I've said there, with every release, the amount of things that annoy you is just dropping and dropping and dropping. Back, CRM4 2011, when they really didn't have a good idea of what they wanted this to be, there was a lot of issues. Now, there's a lot more freedom. And then with, custom workflows, business process flows, all these different things, it does really allow you to have a bit more freedom. Source control can be difficult. As I mentioned before, it's essentially an XML file that you import into a UI. So you can obviously keep that. However, if you have an organization and they have a sysadmin, and someone comes up to the sysadmin and says, I want to make a change, what's going to happen is generally that sysadmin's just going to go, fine, it's not an issue, I'll give you permissions. The minute that happens, someone will decide, oh, we just need a field, we're not going to pay for someone to do that, or we're not going to call up someone to do that, we're just going to do it ourselves. So then what ends up happening is you run into this issue where your development/test environment doesn't link up to your production. Clients are notorious for doing this, and basically they'll say, oh no, we didn't add it, and you sort of look at it and go, well, I can tell you someone did. What I like to do is the default solution you can actually set a prefix on. Every solution has a prefix, but your default solution you can set a prefix. I leave it as new underscore, which means I can just go into the system and I can run through and I can see if there's any fields in there that say new underscore, I know someone has created at the front end and not using a solution. So I find it's a nice way that I can catch them out and say, hang on, you're telling me you haven't created that, how come that's a new underscore? So if you are doing it for your organization or another organization, I would be ultra conservative with your security roles. Rather than there is a system administrator role within the system, I would never give it to anyone else except for probably yourself and a few other people. And what I would do is if you needed someone with that kind of permission, I would create another one and then actually reduce the actual functionality they have. Because if they are a system admin, they can essentially do anything in the system, which is, in a production system, is a nightmare. As I mentioned before, the developer guide for Dynamics 365 customer engagement. So the link is there. And as I've said down the bottom, NuGet is your friend. So as I said, it used to be great because you could just get a zip and it was fantastic. However, I do like the way that the new website is actually set out. You can actually go to the website, you can get a lot more information. And the NuGet packages are actually really good when you're doing your development because you can actually just go in and say, I want this, I want this, I want this. And obviously it just packages it up and away you go. So I'm coming around to it. Initially it was, you get so used to having this zip file that you extract onto your drive that, you know, when they change it after 10 years, you sort of don't know what to do with yourself. But I think probably NuGet is the way to go. As I said, I'm still not really happy with the way that the tools work, except there's so many good little scripts on the Microsoft page that basically say copy and paste this code and it'll install it for you in a tools directory. So you don't actually need to sit down and try and figure out how to script out that yourself, because you can just go straight to this customer engagement page and it'll show you. Developing an inquiry form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over, and so here's my lovely little website. So this is actually an Angular website because, you know, I'm sure most of you would know that Adam loves Angular. So because Adam loves Angular, we all love Angular. And so basically what I've done is I've created this basic sort of shell of a project. And what this project does is basically have two buttons. So what I can do is I can sit here and I can make a decision that I'm going to attend a user group. So I can go in there and I can say I'm going to attend a user group, or I can inquire about events. When I go to these, you'll see that they're very unglamorous pages. But basically what is happening here is it's running my API in the back end. So this is my API here, ticking along in the background. I'm sure none of you will actually be surprised by any of this sort of code. Basically, I've just called it Net User Group API, and I have an API project, and then I have a data project. So my data project is basically where I've tried to constrain all of my CRM Dynamics 365 kind of code to. So you can basically see down the bottom here that we come in here, we've got some references. So I've got the DLLs for the references here. So rather than actually use the NuGet packages in this case, I've actually used the DLLs. So you can actually see here that basically what I'm doing is I'm using 4 different DLLs. So I'm using a tooling connector, an SDK, SDK deployment, and SDK proxy. You can see that I've also got my models, and my models are just general C# classes. There's nothing amazing in here. I can just go into one of these and you can see basically all it is a collection of properties. And basically all I'm doing is with those properties is I'm basically just pulling in the data and I'm just setting the property values. So these are the key functions here. So basically you can see here that I've basically got my function here, and this is my first function, which is going to get my user groups. So what it's going to do is it's just going to call Dynamics. It's going to get me my user groups, and then what it's going to do is it's going to populate it back into a list of user groups. So you can see here, I'm calling this Dynamics 365 connections, and then I'm saying get multiple records. So this is my custom library. The reason I'm using a custom library is I'll show you in a minute, just because I was doing a couple of different functions that were doing the same thing, it just sort of made sense to put it in this library. So what it's going to do is it's going to pass in the get multiple records. User group is the name of my object. So you can see that it's got that prefix, net user group underscore. And then just over here on the right hand side, you can see that this is telling it what columns I want. So I'm passing in a string. And the string array basically has name, location, and description. Nothing very glamorous. And what it's going to do is it's going to return me this entity collection here, which is what gets returned from the Dynamics 365 code. So I'll just jump into here and you can actually see what's happening. So basically what I'm doing is I'm passing in those parameters, and then what I'm doing is I'm passing in a connection string. My connection string is nothing glamorous. It's the name of my Dynamics instance. It's my password and it's my username. And I'm passing that into my CRM service client, which you can see here is actually CRM service client is actually part of the libraries I'm using. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and then I'm going to pass that into my organization service interface, and it's going to return me my organization service. So you can see here, basically it's just doing some checks for null, and then it's just checking the proxy client, and then it's just returning it a copy of this. So this object is basically now instantiated with my organization service. My organization service is then going to take in a query. So it's got my entity name, which again, entity name is just your object. And then my column set, which is just a collection of, it's just a string array. and it's going to return a collection of entities. So that's basically all my code is as far as Dynamics 365 goes. It's not a whole lot of code there. This is going to return multiple records, and then if I skip down, oh, hang on, I might skip up. Here we go, I'll skip up. You can see this is going to return a single record. Very much the same thing. I've just got my service declared. I'm doing a retrieve. I've got, in this case, I've got entity name, and then you can see I've also got the GUID because I'm returning a single record. So a GUID is always a unique identifier within Dynamics. So I've got that, and then I've also got my columns on the right-hand side here as well. Come down the bottom, and I've got, here I'm writing some data. Again, same thing, using the same service. I'm passing in my entity name, I'm passing in some columns, and I'm also passing in an entity reference. So an entity reference is essentially my links from object to object. So in this case, I have my user group. Within my user group, I have sessions, and basically what I do is I pass in those sessions as an entity reference so that I can map the two, and I get the data back. So basically down the bottom, I've got this create. So you can see we've got a create, we've got a read, or we've got retrieve, and we've got retrieve multiple. So basically these are all coming from Dynamics. So basically if I click on this, you'll see here's a list of names. Not formatted, not ordered, probably should have ordered it, but this is a list of people who are coming from Dynamics. So if I jump over to my Dynamics, and I'll come in here, I'll go to contacts, you're going to see a bunch of names, and the name should be familiar because it's the same names that we're displaying. So here you go. So you can see here the first record is me, and then I've got some more records here, 24 people all up. I feel like we've got more than 24 people in there, so I don't know what's going on there. Maybe they're deactivated people. But you can see that all of this is coming from the system. So what I can do in this case is pick George as a user or a contact. And then I can select my user group. So we can go Sydney, we can go Melbourne, we can go Gold Coast. Again, this is all coming from the system. And then I can pick which session they want to go to. So in this case, I'm going to go with the single page applications. And I'm going to submit. So when I'm submitting, if everything goes well, you can see here that it's basically created a record. So there's nothing really that amazing about it. It basically, all we need to do is create a connection using the organization service. Once we've done that, then we can do our basic CRUD commands. So if you understand how APIs work, front end works, you're already going to understand how to create a website. So basically all you need to do is ensure that when you create your objects in your website, you're basically just going to, at some point, have to map them back to your Dynamics 365 data. That's really all you need to do. It's no different to essentially trying to pick a different database, essentially. As long as you know how that basic connection works, all you're doing is just triggering it and saying, we're going to go to this one rather than this one. I can jump back, and I can inquire about events. You can say, again, lovely glamorous form. Let's say William here. So I'm just going to enter that basic information. I'm going to click submit. Again, I haven't actually done anything in here. I probably should have done a successful message or something like that. However, what we can do is we can actually check the data and we can confirm that it's actually in the system. So if I come into inquiries, here we go. We should have a copy of William. Now, I'm just going to click on this, and hopefully if I'm fast enough, I'm going to be able to click on here. And it looks like I should have been fast enough. Okay. There you go, good old live demos, hey? So basically, what this should be doing at the moment is we should be actually seeing a workflow in here. What it's going to do is it's actually going to select that contact. So you can see this one above. What it's done is I've included this and I've said, okay, this is my name, this is my email. What I want you to do is I want you to check this name and I want you to see if it exists as a contact. If it exists as a contact, I want you to map to it. If it doesn't, I want you to create it. Oh, that's why, because I'm looking at background processes. So you can see here, it's basically run twice. All it's doing is link to contact. So this is my link to contact record. And when I can come down to the bottom here, you can see basically all it's doing is saying, check my inquiry and see whether or not my contact field is populated. If my contact field is not populated, what I want you to do is I want you to run this custom code which says link to contact. So that's some C# code that I'm running in the background. You can see I've got ticks, so the ticks tell me that there was no problems. Now what's the bet? We're going to go back here and miraculously, oh no. Oh, here we go. Good example. So there you go. Here's a good example. So there you go. I've managed to do that pretty well. So basically you can see what's happened here is what it's done is it's actually run the workflow and I've had an error. So rather than me having to guess what happened with a plugin, what I can actually see here is it's actually telling me what my error was. So you can see within my plugin execute, it's telling me that I've got a missing method exception, method not found. So I'm guessing it's something to do with my phone number, but I'll have a look in a minute. So we're going to come to that in a minute. I just thought it was an interesting segue that we'll continue on to a minute. So, as I said, basically we've got our retrieve multiple, we've got our create, and then we've also got a couple of others. So here's that basic code that you saw. Sorry, I do apologise. I probably should have coloured this a bit better. However, you can see up the top, there's my connection string. So my connection string is just telling me what my auth type is. It's telling me my username, my password, and my URL. That's it. And then I'm just passing that connection string into my CRM service client, which, as I said, is coming from my DLL. You can get it from the DLL or you can get it from the NuGet package. I'm creating an instance of my service interface there. And then in this case, you can see down the bottom, I'm just doing a retrieve. No, I do not want to do an update. Go away. So here is the different items we can do. You can see we can associate, which basically says, I want to link this record to this record. We can do a create by passing in a whole entity. So we can sit there and say, okay, I want to create this with all of these different fields. We can delete a record by passing in the name of the record type as well as the ID. We can disassociate, obviously remove the link between the records. We can do an execute, which is basically allowing us to do a whole bunch of different requests. A good example for an execute is you can do a who am I command. So for instance, if you're creating a UI that you want people to do a custom connection string, what might be a good way for you to do it is basically have all that information, have them, when they trigger it, say submit, okay. When they do that, do a who am I request, which will actually return information about the user to say whether or not they're valid. So things like that is what you can do with your execute there and your organization request. You can retrieve, which will retrieve a single record. You can retrieve multiple based on a query. So that query allows you to say, I would like to retrieve multiple records based on some filter, whether or not that's saying, whether or not you can actually, if you wanted to, you could retrieve one record, but you could actually say where all of my records are of this type or any of my children equal this value. It's basically using an OData kind of query. So you can essentially do whatever you really want. Anything you can do with OData, you can basically do through that. And then basically your update down the bottom, which again is passing in a whole entity and then making any modifications to it. So with your update, generally what you'll do in most cases is you'll do a retrieve first. and you'll get the record, or retrieve multiple, get the record. And then once you've got that record, what you would then do is do any changes, and then you would pass it back with an update. Because if you pass it back with the update, then it's already got the identifier and it knows what record it is. Otherwise, what you could do is you could create a brand new instance of entity and just make sure that you set the identifier. And if you've set the identifier, it will make sure that it updates any of the values that you've put into that object. So if you don't include a particular, let's say you include first name as an update and you don't include last name, it'll ignore last name, but it'll update first name. Custom workflow. So as you saw so beautifully before when it failed, I have this custom code. So you can see basically it's just, again, this is just a C# library. If you want to have your custom code or you want to have a plugin, it's just a C# library that you build. You can see up the top I've got my usings, which is again those same DLLs from before, my SDK. I've got a couple of different service ones here. I've got service model and service activities. So you can see the activities we actually use in a couple of different places. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class, and my class is going to inherit code activity. So when it inherits code activity, it then knows that it has to have this execute function. So this execute function is basically what's going to run. That's going to run for a plugin or any custom workflow. So then I'm going to pass in my context. So my context is essentially going to be able to tell me, when I come down here, you can see it's essentially just one line difference. Instead of me having to pass in my connection string, because I'm actually running this code within Dynamics 365, instead I get my context, and then I use my context to then end up generating my service. So you can see here we are again with the same organization service. In this case though, it's retrieving the context. So obviously with the context, what you can do is you can actually say, tell me what record this ran for, or any of that kind of information. Tell me which user this workflow was triggered by. All of those kinds of things you can get from the activity context. And you can also actually build up your organization service. And then once I've got my organization service, you're going to start seeing that it's just basically the same thing as we had before. So I'm calling that same service, and I'm saying service, and then I'm going to retrieve. Same thing again. Here's my name of my object as a string. Here's my GUID that I'm passing in. And then here's my attributes, which you can again see is basically a string. In this case, it's a column set, which is a column set is basically, as you can see, just a array of string essentially. So it's kind of strange because in some cases it's just expecting a string array, and in other places it's expecting a column set, which is a string array. So it's kind of a bit strange like that, but nevertheless, I'm sure there's a reason for it. And so then basically what's going to happen is I'm going to return my inquiry here. And so what that inquiry is basically when I've run my workflow is run within the context of that record. So I know that my primary entity ID is going to be the ID of that record. So I've then retrieved all of the information from that record, and I'm just going to check every object that I have and say, can you tell me whether or not I have a value for email? If I have a value for email, I'm going to do a check. I'm going to see whether or not this email address exists in contact or not. So you can see here basically what I'm doing is I'm saying my entity name, my column set is just email, and then I'm adding in some criteria. My criteria is checking the email from the inquiry, and it's checking status code of 1. So status code of 1 is active. So I'm just doing that as a fail-safe to ensure that I'm not picking up any old records that might have been deactivated. A big issue with Dynamics is if you delete a record, it's deleted forever, and it deletes any of the history of that record. So what generally we find is you try and get your clients, or you try and get yourself, to deactivate a record instead of deleting it, because if you delete it, all your history is gone. So you can see that you go through all this information. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to check whether or not this person exists. If it doesn't, it's going to build them, and it's going to create the record service.create. Just in summary of that bit, as you can see, all we need to do is ensure that we inherit code activity, and then we ensure that we have an execute function that's passing in context. Then within that, basically all we're going to do is essentially say, instead of actually passing in our connection string, we're going to pass in our context and use that to generate our interface service. So yeah, so basically the Dynamics 365 JavaScript is all built on the XRM libraries of functionality. So you can see here that we've got the XRM.page up the top, and then within that we've all got these children. So we've got context, we've got data, we've got UI. So underneath UI we have controls, we have navigation, we have tabs, we have sections, we have controls. We have data where we have entities, we have processes, and we have attributes. And what we can do is within our form properties, now what we can do is we can actually set this, we have a collection of basic events. We can do on load, we can do on save, and what we can do is we can also say on change of a record. So what you can say is, okay, when a record is updated, sorry, not a record, when a control is updated, you want to do something. In this case, what I've done is I've just basically done it on load. And I'm going to grab this all, and I'm going to move it to Notepad. So I have a function which is just called check for inquiry. So check for inquiry, the first one you're going to see is this xrm.page.ui.getFormType. So get form type, I've basically just said where it's not one, because one is a create type. So basically if it's a create type of a form, I know it's not going to be linked to anything. So that's why I don't want my JavaScript to trigger then. And then what I'm doing is I'm passing in my inquiry here. And you can see basically what I'm doing is I'm checking inquiry and I'm filtering it where my netug underscore contact ID equals, and then what it's doing is it's checking xrm.page.data.entity.getID. So it's returning the GUID from the form for that record. It's then going to pass in the information down to this make request, which you can see is just some wacky kind of standard OData connection. So it's basically getting the OData endpoint and then it's doing a request and it's going to return me my result. When I get my result, if my result is nothing, or it's, in this case, if it's an empty string, I'm going to ignore it. If it's not an empty string, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide all those additional information. So you can see here that basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I want you to hide on my summary tab, I want you to hide the social pane, I want you to hide the summary section, and I want you to hide the customer details tab. And then down the bottom there, you can see what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, this entire details tab, I want you to hide that as well. So this is probably not a great real world example because I'm probably not going to do this, but it just kind of shows you a couple of the different things that you can do using the XRM. So this XRM is just available out of the box. This is built into Dynamics. So everything you do basically is going to have XRM in it if you want to interact with the data or you interact with the form. So as I said briefly before, you can do all kinds of wacky stuff. You can actually change colors of backgrounds of the controls, or you can actually add in alerts, or you can add in additional fields, hide fields, all that kind of stuff. And if I jump over into our Dynamics, and I click on Benno. So in this case, I know that Benno does not have an inquiry. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this slightly smaller. So you can see that Benno doesn't have an inquiry. So Benno's got his contact information on the left. He's got his social pane. He's got some information on the right. And then I'm going to come down the bottom too, and you're going to see here, he's also got his details. So what my code does is says, if I'm linked to an inquiry, I don't want to see any of that. I just want to see the basic information. So you can see here, all it's going to do is this is the exact same form. All it's doing is checking the relationship, and the relationship is telling me that it's related to an inquiry. So it's going to return nothing else. So you can see here, it's returning nothing on the left and right. And then you can see that down the bottom here, I can't scroll anymore. I don't have my details. So as I said, back in the day, you used to do everything by JavaScript. Now you can do a lot of this kind of basic stuff using business rules. The one thing that I do find is you can actually hide sections. So a tab is essentially a collection of sections. So a tab I'll go back to the other one to illustrate my point. A tab is, can you see up the top here, I've got this summary in red. Summary is a tab. Summary is a collection of sections underneath, and I can hide those sections, I can't hide the tab, oddly enough, using a business rule. So if I don't want summary to be displayed, I still need to use JavaScript. If I just wanted to hide these sections, there's nothing wrong with me doing it via a business rule. Obviously, if you do it with a business rule, it's better for long-term maintenance because you don't have that JavaScript code that you need to worry about maintaining. If you wanted to set, you can see here this little red asterisk up on the left-hand side. That tells you this is mandatory. Thank you very much, William. If I want to set a field as mandatory or not mandatory, or I want to set this as disabled, I can do this using business rules now. So there's not a massive amount of JavaScript, but with your ability to know JavaScript and understanding that this XRM library exists, you can basically get past doing any kind of little JavaScript tasks you need. Try and do it through a business rule. If you find that your business rule isn't complex enough, that's when you jump over and you do some JavaScript. So here on this summary, I just wanted to go through some of the ones that we use. So again, get form type. We can see the various form types in this. So we can see there's create, there's update, there's read only, there's a few other ones as well. I can chain my information. I can say, okay, on xrm.page.ui, I want to see .tabs and then tell me if I have a tab named, in this case, tab name. And then I can chain on sections as well. I can use data.entity.getID if I want my unique identifier for that record that I'm currently looking at. And then these next ones, what I can do is I can say I want to set the field name. I can get the field name, and then this last one will actually let me save the record too. So what you can do is you can actually, as you're making changes, if someone changes something, what you can do is you can actually update the form immediately and it'll refresh if you need to do that. Feedback form. See, you're all too good, so I didn't need to put this one in here. I don't know if David was excellent or someone else was, but useful tools. If you are going to look at Dynamics 365, there are two things that I will definitely recommend you do. First one is jump online and get the free trial and muck around. Second one is look at XRM Toolbox. There's two different ones. There's XRM Toolkit. XRM Toolkit you have to pay for. XRM Toolkit Toolbox is free. It is built by a whole lot of different developers with little things that they found that they had to actually write their own little custom code for. They've put it within this solution. You can now go in here and you can actually go into a plugin. It'll actually appear at the start. There's a plugins item and there's probably about 50 or 60 different tools that you can do to do various different things. The ones we kind of use is generating fetch XML. If you want to change the sitemap, before I was talking about being able to show and hide the trading area, for instance. If you want to do that, you use a tool in the XRM Toolbox. If you look at the XRM Toolbox and you can actually look at a trial, you're going to be 80% of the way there of understanding Dynamics. Kingsway Soft. If you are doing any integration between a SQL Server database and Dynamics 365, I would go with Kingsway Soft. Essentially what it does is it actually bolts into SSIS and allows you to transfer data to CRM. It takes some of the little complexities out of it, of having to actually worry about doing that connection yourself. It allows you to do create/updates and all those kind of wacky things, and also handling all your mapping and stuff. So if you've done any SSIS packages, essentially, as I said, it's just a toolkit built on SSIS that allows you to do it. If you're going to do it just for development purposes, or you just want to have a look at it, it is free to do development on. It's only when you actually want to deploy it somewhere that you actually have to get a license. The Developer Toolkit, which we mentioned before. This is a Visual Studio extension, and it allows you to update items through Visual Studio directly. So it can be very cool, because what you can do is you can go in, and as I said before, if you have a look at the JavaScript is really quite frustrating to sit here and understand. If you've got a problem, looking at that JavaScript within the UI, within Dynamics, is a nightmare. So what I have always done in the past is take that out and put it in a notepad. Not the most efficient way to handle it, and probably not the best way, because Obviously, there's nothing to stop you from doing an accidental change and then dumping it back in and then running into problems. You know, when you're copying and pasting from one place to another, inevitably something weird happens. Using this toolkit, you don't need to do that. What you can instead do is basically do all of your code within Visual Studio, and then you press a button and it'll deploy it for you. To get it running in Visual Studio 2017, you do have to make some modifications. It's not actually designed to work in 2017 at the moment. It works well in 2013 and 2015. However, they are working on it, and I suspect they'll be released soon, because this was updated, I think, August last year. So I think we're still we're waiting for an update now. Plugin registration tool. The plugin registration tool is a tool that is developed by Microsoft. This is one of those ones I was referring to that you need to use the NuGet package for. And the plugin registration tool will allow you to register any plugins and custom workflow activities. So essentially any DLLs you have, you need to register using this tool. It is quite a frustrating tool to use at times. I was actually mentioning before. Basically, the way that Dynamics works, if you're looking at using an older iteration, you can use an older version of the plugin registration tool. If you're looking at using the latest, if you, for instance, get a trial and then you get a copy of the SDK zip, the SDK zip comes with the plugin registration tool, but it will not work. And it doesn't tell you an error, it just does not work. So going forward, it's going to be kind of interesting for us because we have some clients that have the latest and greatest and some that don't. So as long as the ones that are working on the older versions still work with the latest plugin registration tool will be okay, but it doesn't actually work both ways. I would suspect, as I said, you probably won't do too much plugin development if you do look into Dynamics, because you'll look at doing what I was showing before, where you do a custom workflow activity instead. But as I said, you still need to register it through here. So you create your standard C# DLLs, and then you import it into here. So just briefly in summary, development within Dynamics should be open to any Dynamics, any .NET developers. Code can be written in C# and JavaScript. You used to be able to do VB. I don't know if you can still do VB. If you would like to do VB, by all means, go right ahead and try. Developer tools make your life easier. Because Dynamics has been around for so long now, there are so many good tools out there that people have spent their hard-earned time, but that doesn't really work. But basically, their free time developing, and these tools can just make life so much easier. As I said, little things like updating the sitemap to add in some different icons, and being up to, basically there's a lot of different views within Dynamics. So, you know, for instance, you might have on your base page, you might have one view, but then on a related one, you can actually have a different view. So let's say when you come onto that first page, you want to see all of your information. But if I'm going to my account, I might only, for my contact, I only might want to see first name and number. Basically, I can handle those as different views. Out of the box is approximately, I think, 5 different views. If you want to have them all the same and then make a change, there's a little plugin that you can basically use in that, where you just press a button and say, make all my views the same, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and remove any fields. It's a lot easier to remove fields than it is to add fields, which is a bit strange, but it is the way it is. And learning Dynamics 365 can save developers a huge amount of time if you are doing these back-end kind of systems. They do tick 90% of the boxes for a lot of organizations. So if it's going to tick 90% of the boxes, you're going to be able to find that that 10%, you're probably going to be smart enough to be able to figure out some way in Dynamics or some way around it to cover that area. So if you are doing a back-end system, I would suggest that you don't actually sit there and say, I'm going to write this from scratch. You sit there and, whether or not it's Dynamics 365 or something else, you consider what else is out there and what's going to make your life easier. And that would be the end of the talk. No. Have I covered everything?